Morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning we are privileged to have with us Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization, joining us from Potsdam, Germany, for another fascinating discussion. I always love these, and I can't wait to get started. Harley, how was your Christmas?
Well, other than the fact that everyone in my household was sick, it was not bad.
Oh, okay. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was just telling Andy we had fondue Christmas Eve and no one could taste it. So,
Oh, it's that kind of, because I've heard that with COVID, at least some of the variant thing, you lose your sense of taste. Is that
yeah,
what you think?
that's true. The
Wow.
kids didn't. The kids were okay. They
Okay.
had their sense of taste. Pia and I lost ours.
Okay. But you're fine.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. And Andy's been through it too. It's no secret that Andy had COVID over the past few days, and he's on the way back too. He says he's going to do a show tonight, folks. So mark your calendar for 10 or 10:15 or maybe 10:20 if you know Andy. All right. So enough of that. Harley, let's get into the important matters of the day. Where would you like to start?
Well, let's start with this crazy back and forth going on between the United States and the Russians. When Putin and Biden met on December 7th, Biden agreed that there would be further negotiations over the main topic on Putin's list, which is the whole question of NATO expansion. And what Putin is arguing is very simply that NATO is moving, if it incorporates Ukraine into NATO, the Baltic states are already in, if Georgia comes in, then there will be a ring around Russia's territory with possible nuclear weapons. And if you have nuclear weapons in Ukraine, they're 4 to 6 minutes away from Moscow. And Putin said that's just not acceptable. And he said we need to have a signed agreement that says there'll be no further NATO expansion eastward and no deployment of these kinds of offensive weapons into Ukraine. And then further, that the accords that were reached in the negotiations, the so-called Normandy format, or the Minsk Accords, in which there would be autonomy granted to the eastern Ukrainian area, the Donbass. The Ukrainians have never fulfilled that negotiation, that promise. So Putin said the U.S. must help to make sure that happens. Now, that's all pretty reasonable, especially we just saw the documents from 1994-95, which showed that in 1990, definitively, Genscher, who was the foreign minister of Germany at the time, and Baker, the foreign secretary, the Secretary of State from the United States, James Baker, told Gorbachev that if Russia allowed the unification of Germany and also pulled back the Warsaw Pact, that there would be not 1 inch eastward movement of NATO. And since that time, they've incorporated all of the Eastern European countries. And so when the Russians get nervous, when they see military maneuvers on their borders, when they see reconnaissance planes going over to look at the Russian troop formation, Russian defenses, and so on, then the Russians are saying, look, we're a blip on a radar mistake from going to war, and this is not acceptable. So Biden agreed in the summit they had, the video summit, that there would be talks. Now, the U.S. is saying, and when I say the U.S., I'm saying Sullivan and Blinken in particular, are saying you can't dictate the policy of NATO. That's up to the NATO members, not to the Russians. And Putin is saying, well, you made an agreement. There was a handshake agreement. We want it in writing. And so it was announced today that they will be meeting on January 10th. But in the meantime, before that was announced, Sullivan said, we have a 4-week window to cool off the confrontation. That is the so-called Russian invasion forces on the border, which the United States and NATO are saying they have intelligence assessments that say Putin is about to invade Ukraine. Now, that puts us on a real razor's edge. And I think people need to know this, that the documents that have been produced then that showed further discussions between Clinton and Yeltsin in 1994, where Clinton essentially said, well, we'll have a kind of partnership with Russia. It wasn't quite an invitation to join NATO, but that was being discussed at the time. Instead, that was in July 94. By December, after the Democrats got smashed in the midterm elections, Clinton withdrew that and basically said, you can't tell us who can be members of NATO. So from that period to this period, there's been this steady intrusion onto closer and closer to Russian territory. And this is why Putin is raising this. So the question is, we haven't heard much from Biden on this. Now, hopefully he's aware of it. He's aware that the discussion has been confirmed for January 10th. But who's going to make the policy? Is it Blinken and Sullivan who say the Russians can't tell us what to do? Putin is saying there's a red line. If you cross the red line, the Russians will have to respond. And in particular, the defense secretary of Russia and also the deputy foreign minister Ryabkov warned that they have indications there could be something done out of Kiev, that is from the Ukrainian side, to launch either a strike into the Donbas region or a false flag operation that would lead to basically Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's very dicey, very dangerous. And then just one other note on this, there was some talk from a retired general that South Korea is not cooperating with the US and Japan in committing itself to an anti-China military defense. Now, we've been saying all along, that is the US, that there is no intent to have a military containment of China. But these documents that were released by the South Koreans, who said they don't want to participate in that, indicates that the US is pushing for a military containment of China in Asia. So, we're heading into a new year. It seems as though the Christmas spirit didn't last that long. The spirit of the Putin-Biden dialogue didn't last that long. It's very worrisome to look at this situation and realize that once again, there were US reconnaissance flights right up to the edge of Russian airspace, photographing the Russian deployments. Obviously, Putin is worried, he's concerned. And the worst thing you can do in a case of something like this is say to Putin, we think you're bluffing. And that's, in a sense, what Sullivan and Blinken are doing.
Well, there's a lot there, and it's a lot. It's a lot to cover. I want to start where you began, and that is with the and you folks at LaRouche and the Schiller organization institute are making tremendous appeals to reason, logic, to saying, where is the sense in American policy? It's obvious that this is leading us toward a war. If not a nuclear war at the beginning, then it certainly is possible that it turns into one. Once something starts, you never know where it's going to go. War is notorious like that. So it should frighten Americans, but we're not frightened. We're not. And here's my theory as to why we're not frightened. It's because it is completely out of our hands. We have no voice whatsoever in American policy as citizens of this country. So you can convince me, you can convince any thinking person that you're right. But what is important is it's not what Biden thinks if he still does that. It is what the puppet masters think, the ones that pull his strings. And this leads me directly to Wall Street.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, the efforts need to be directed to the big banks. Just tell them why they shouldn't let the world drift into war, and not ask the American people to change the policy of this country, which we have absolutely no control over.
Well, I would disagree with you slightly on that, John. I agree with your overall assessment that this is not in the interests of the average American. And I would also agree with your assessment that most people don't think a war is possible. Either they're not following this, it's not in the media, or they've been convinced that the idea of a war between Russia and the United States would be so dangerous and so such an existential threat to civilization that it will never happen. But I'll just remind people that in the summer of 1914, no one thought that by September, all of Europe would be engaged in a war that would last 4+ years. These are the problems with having a military industrial complex, or at that time a military, which is committed to a certain strategic perspective and locks in on that and leaves out the alternative of dialogue and discussion. So it's true, the average person has very little impact on this, except look what happened in 2016. It may not have been the first thing on people's minds, but Donald Trump made a very effective point that if Hillary Clinton is elected, her strategy towards Syria could lead to a US-Russian war. And this was something that he said quite often on the campaign trail, in the debates. And then secondly, he kept saying, why should we be enemies with Russia? Why can't we be friends? And he talked about this from a positive standpoint of cooperation. And then the third point in his 2016 campaign was veiled threats at Wall Street, because it's clear that Trump understands on a fundamental level that the war policy was coming in part from some of the military, but it was also coming from the non-military players in the corporate cartels who needed war. War is an essential thing for them. So when Trump came in, we didn't have a single new war start during that 4 years of his presidency. He didn't do a very effective job of ousting the people controlling things. And some people say, well, maybe because he was either afraid of them or he was part of the system. I think what it showed in 2016 is that if you have a leader who's willing to make a break from the policies of war and austerity and geopolitical confrontation, if you have a leader who's willing to break with that, you'll get a response in the population. My complaint with Donald Trump right now is that in the midst of this serious crisis, he's spending most of his time fundraising for the overturn of the 2020 election. You know, we could be facing a nuclear war. He should be out front on this issue the way he was in 2016 against Hillary, because the same people who ran Hillary are the ones running this war policy through the Biden administration.
Well, let's focus on that then. Who would you put on that list?
Well, if you look at the people who are out front, they're just basically functionaries, people like Blinken, Sullivan. They go back to the 90s and the early parts of the 2000s as part of the broader Clinton operation. Some of them were around the State Department. Someone who's no one's ever heard of, Donald Fried, a former ambassador who was actually the person at the State Department in charge of sanctions after the Ukraine coup in 2014. He's now at the Atlantic Council. And that's where you start looking and seeing where these policies are coming from. The Atlantic Council is heavily funded by Martin Marietta, the defense contractors in the United States and the United Kingdom. This is where you start when you look at who's pushing for war. But what are they integrated in? They're integrated into a global financial system. This is where we get to the bankers. The people who are pushing the Great Reset are the same ones who are willing to have wars if that takes people's minds off the fact that they're about to be uh, penniless and bankrupt and out on the street. So I think you have to look at the Wall Street, City of London, European Central Bank, Frankfurt bankers, the interconnected financial cartels, which are also completely interwoven with the corporate cartels, what was called the synarchists in the 1920s, the trusts, the corporate trusts that funded Hitler, and that after World War II brought British intelligence in to organize the American intelligence community. So that's where you start. Now, then you say, well, if you're an average person, how do you affect that? Well, this is where one of the things Lyndon LaRouche did was put forward a strategy that addresses both the strategic crisis and the financial crisis. And that was his four law policy, the four economic laws, which starts with a return to regulated banking, Glass-Steagall, which would basically say to those corporate financiers who think they're protected because of bailouts and bail-ins, that under Glass-Steagall, if you're engaged in speculative investment, there's no bailout and no bail-in. There's a complete separation between commercial banking and private or financial trading. And the traders are go ahead and trade all you want, but you're not going to be protected. What happened after 2008 is we had an opportunity to take down the power of the big banks, who had pretty much been everything that had been going their way since the 1970s. And there was a brief moment where McCain, during the campaign, was thinking of coming out against the bailout. And instead, I think his military industrial buddies told him, you have to do the bailout. And he and Obama went to Washington. They met during the campaign, I think it was in October, with Hank Paulson and Bush, and they came out of the meeting saying, we have to do the bailout. And the bailout was premised on two things: protect the Western financial system, the so-called systemically important financial institutions, and secondly, continue the idea that the U.S. is the unilateral military power, and that with NATO as a subordinate will dictate the military policy of the world, as well as the trade policy and the financial policy. And what's crucial to understand is these guys have destroyed that financial system. They've turned it into a one-way rocket to the top for the richest people in the world, who are getting just floods of liquidity for their speculative ventures. But there's a difference between liquidity and solvency. The system is insolvent. They're building these castles on top of a system that's collapsing. And that's why they're moving toward war, toward censorship, toward control of the narrative through the media. So, the problem is, you're not going to influence them. You're not going to convince people like Blinken and Sullivan that they're doing the wrong thing. You're probably not going to convince Klaus Schwab or Prince Charles or the people who are running the Great Reset, Mark Carney, Larry Fink of BlackRock. You're not going to convince them. The question is, can we use the upcoming elections to build a juggernaut for economic change and transformation that will take power away from these bankers? And it's going to be tough because everybody is being directed in 30 different directions on gender issues, race issues, the 2020 election. There's so many divisive matters that are being put in front of people, and the debate is dominated by these kinds of immediate passions. Now, some of these things are important, like the question of who decides what children shall learn in school. Do parents have a say? These are important issues. But you have to recognize they're being used to divide people and divert them from acknowledging or recognizing that there's a bankrupt elite that will go to war if necessary to protect their interests, and their interests are not your interests.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you that the normal avenues of petition for redress of grievances are shut down, just like the Capitol building itself, fenced in, guarded, and prohibiting of this type of influence that citizens should make in a democracy. So, as much as I would like to help with this, I don't know who to call. You know, who do I call? You know, what's their phone number? I'll just give me their name. I'll find the phone number. But there's somebody in Goldman Sachs that has a conscience. Maybe I could get in touch with somebody over at the Bank of England that hasn't got corrupted yet. Is there anybody in no NATO? Forget NATO, right? So are we going to end up having to call on Putin to say, "Hey, Putin, can you start something over here in terms of education?" And how in the world are Americans going to get out of this trap? Where I think the real flaw in the American system is our reliance on the separation of powers. The idea that if we have a separate judiciary, that the right side will always prevail, and the democracy and the republic, I should say, will be preserved. But there is another power out there that's been very, very, very evident, and that is the media. And the media is not in the Constitution. It's not restrained in any way, and it is totally owned by these moguls that run the cartels that you just spoke of. So I'm sorry.
And John,
Frustrated. I'm looking for some way to make a difference, and other than doing these broadcasts, I'm not finding much.
well, I wouldn't underestimate the potential for these broadcasts to take off, especially as the crisis worsens. And you are one of the people out there that's put your finger on how this corrupt cabal of criminal speculators functions. And let me just give you an example of something that's happening here in Germany right now. In November, there was a spike in utility prices because of the insanity of the Green New Deal and the shutdown of nuclear power and the moves against coal and the essentially moving toward the green agenda, which is giving speculators a free hand to drive up prices, because people know that the wind and solar won't make up the gap between what we use and what we produce. So at first, people were just kind of saying, "Oh, gee, I guess my bills are going up." Now we're hearing in Italy, 50% increase in electricity prices starting in January. 50%, which means people are going to have to choose between heating their homes in the winter and providing food for their family. This is going to get worse because the Green New Deal is not going to work. Now, at some point, people start to ask questions about why is all this going on? What's happening? Why is it? Here's another thing that came out, which was not published anywhere in the West, but Putin did a press conference on December 23rd, and he was asked, why isn't Russia providing the gas that they promised to Western Europe? And Putin said, well, first of all, we are fulfilling our contracts. However, the firms in Germany are buying the cheap gas from Russia and reselling it at higher prices to Poland and the Czech Republic. So here you have a perfect example of how Russia was trying to work with Germany to provide cheap energy to deal with this problem. And instead, they're turning around and selling it in Poland and elsewhere to make a profit. Now, did that appear in any American paper that Putin raised that? Now, at the same time, the argument against Nord Stream 2, that Russia won't deliver the gas and will hold the West hostage, is proving to be false. Russia is providing or fulfilling its contract. Who's not fulfilling contracts? The American firms that can get more money for the natural gas that they sell in Asia. So they're selling less to Russia. So, you have this worst of all possible worlds. It's quite cold in Germany so far this winter, and utility rates are going through the roof. Now, what happens? Will people figure that out? We have a new government in Germany that's dominated by Greens. And the Greenies are the ones who are saying, shut down nuclear, shut down coal, shut down fossil fuel, go all to all electric cars. Well, yes, we don't have the capability to do that, but we still have to do it anyway. And those same people are the ones who are saying we have to be prepared to confront Putin in Ukraine. So will people wake up? I mean, we have a small organization in Germany. We're talking to a lot of people, including retired diplomats, office holders, elected officials. And what do we hear from them? Well, the government's going along with NATO and the United States. We can't do anything about it. So, you get into this loop where, the question is, at what point do people realize that it's not just you're being inconvenienced, but your life may be at stake? If Russia invades Ukraine because they're provoked by the crazies in Kiev, how long will it be if there are German bombers flying over Ukraine with nuclear weapons, which the new government is calling for, before Russia decides they have to do preemptive strikes in Germany? Now, I would say that's probably not on the front of people's minds in Germany as we head into the new year. But we're trying to make it. We're trying to put that in people's minds and raise the question of whatever happened to the peace movement? Whatever happened to the idea of diplomacy and negotiation? Why is that lost? Now, in the US, you have people like Tulsi Gabbard. Even in an ironic way, Tucker Carlson has been saying, look, we could end up in a war. Don't think it couldn't happen. And he singled out Roger Wicker, the senator from Mississippi, who said we shouldn't rule out the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Well, the fact that Tucker Carlson has the largest audience talk show on TV, maybe that's getting through. I think he should do that every night, raise that question. Others have to come forward. There are plenty of people who know how dangerous it is. We had interviews recently with former top officials, Chaz Freeman, State Department official for 30 years. He was one of the people who helped open up China. Graham Fuller, a Middle East expert. We're doing, through the Executive Intelligence Review and our publications, as much as we can to reach these officials and tell them, speak out, say something, do something. It hasn't added up yet, but I think if we keep pushing, we're going to come to a point where either we make a breakthrough before the shit hits the fan, or else, get down on your knees and pray.
We can always do that.
Yeah, that's true.
And I personally think it's a pretty good idea.
Maybe it brings some comfort.
In regard to trying to find a way, as I said, I'm kind of discouraged, but I don't want to discourage anybody from what you all are doing. And I think it's great that you're doing that, and you've got the contacts, and with a small organization, you're doing wonderful work. In this country, it's just, I'm still not seeing any, like, for instance, let's just play with my situation. I live in a kind of a smaller county of Maryland, which is part of the district of Representative Steny Hoyer, who is at this time, I think, either the majority whip or the speaker or somewhere. He's way up there in the Democratic Party and has been for many, many years. He cannot be defeated. It's just in the next election, if he runs, then he won't be defeated. If he doesn't run, then somebody else that he appoints will have so much momentum that that might be interesting. It might be worthwhile. But as things stand right now, putting energy into opposing Steny Hoyer in this district is crazy. It would just, you might get a little bit of press, but more likely you just turn yourself into an object of ridicule, because the press and the entire area thrives on the economy that depends upon the military industrial complex, where we have a number of military bases all over southern Maryland, and everywhere. All around us. It's all about military. If the military disappeared from southern Maryland, then the economy would die. People's little businesses would die. Everything, all the little towns would die, and it would be a disaster. So I don't know what to do about that, except for to try to look somewhere else for a solution. The governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, is what I would call a rhino. He's a Republican, but he goes along with pretty much what the deep state wants. He's a get along to go along to get along guy. And he's married to a Korean woman who we think has some interesting connections to South Korea. And who knows where the influence really lies in these cases anymore, since the whole country seems to be falling into division, as you said earlier. The provision of numerous issues that we can divide ourselves on is just keeps multiplying. But how in the world do I? And then I've got the two senators that are both knuckleheads. I can't.
You're being generous.
Chris Van Hollen and the really insidiously evil one, in my opinion, Ben Cardin. These guys are deep. I mean, you can't shake them. If they are told, they're like the Tony Blinkens of Maryland. Okay, they're going to do what they're told to do, and there's nothing you can do about it because they've got all the talking points and all. They've got friends everywhere. The pictures of them with all these great humanitarians. I mean, it's a very difficult way. So I'm just putting that out there for any comments you might have.
Well, if you go person by person in the Congress, you might as well start digging your grave, because there are very few of them who have shown the combination of intelligence and guts to stand up and fight. But here's, again, I'm not trying to convince you or anyone that this fight can be won. I'm just telling you it has to be won if mankind is going to survive. And look at what just happened in England, in the United Kingdom. There was a by-election, and it was a seat that had been held by the Tories since, I think, 1800. And they lost. They lost because of the complete chaos affecting the financial structure in England, the work situation, the healthcare situation. And there's more of that to come. In France, Macron is only at about 25% of support. You have someone who's portraying herself as an old-line Gaullist who went from nowhere to over 20% overnight. There are people who are starting to listen and who are open for new ideas. The question is, can we get those new ideas out there? Because the biggest problem, you mentioned the media, that's a big problem. I would say the think tanks and the universities are a part of that problem, because we no longer have an emphasis on critical thinking in education. It's going back to the W. Bush era, the testing, the standardized testing, the way they shifted things. But it goes back longer than that. We haven't had a real classical curriculum. I don't know about you, John, but when I was in high school, we read Shakespeare every year in our English class. We had an orchestra or a chorus where almost everyone was a part of that. There was a classical culture that wasn't dominant, but was there for everyone to participate in. That's gone. In many of the high schools in the United States, you can go through high school without reading a Shakespeare play. You can go through without taking languages now. So you have and then you have the selection process, which takes the children of the wealthiest and the children of the people we're talking about, of the oligarchs, gives them the Ivy League education, which, in my opinion, may not be worth very much, but which is a conditioning to create the Blinkens and the Sullivans and the brainwashed zombies who march to the same beat. So the only thing that can change that is when I remember Lyndon LaRouche at a speech at one point said, what happens when you go home after work and you turn on the light switch and the shower goes on? You turn on the television and instead the oven goes on, where everything you're accustomed to doesn't work. Is that the point at which people change? And I think that's probably our hope, that when people suddenly realize that everything they've been taught and believed in has been overturned, that reality is different from the opinions that you hear expressed on the news. And I think that's happening. You know, the fact that people don't watch CNN anymore, and Fox is falling also. The question is then, where do people go? And, you know, I think that's why I have hope that people like yourself, I have a network of people who do podcasts and have their own websites. You know, we don't reach millions of people. And sometimes we're lucky if we reach 10,000. But you've got to start somewhere. And if the people who listen to your program pick up from you the passion about the fight for change, for transformation, that we have to go back to a truth-based system, that we have to go back to the Republican traditions of this country, and I mean that Republican with a small r, you get enough people who think that way and then go out and organize others, you can make miracles. And that's what we're hoping for now. It's going to take a miracle.
Well, as you usually do, you pull me over to your side. I'm going to now adopt an attitude of positiveness, because what you just signaled in me was the recollection. The first time I read of Fletcher Prouty's book, The Secret Team, which I'm sure you know very well. Near the beginning of it, he describes the scene when Allen Dulles retired, you know, at the insistence of John F. Kennedy, and at the ceremony for the retirement in the brand new CIA headquarters over there in Virginia, in Langley, over there by Great Falls, there was a inscription on the wall that was hidden behind a curtain, and Kennedy made his speech, and then they pulled the curtain back, and the legend on the wall said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And that was Kennedy's message to Dulles, saying, you guys are a bunch of goddamn liars. And it's not until you start telling the truth that you're going to be free. And I could say that for the whole country. And what you just said is a resonance of my deep respect for President Kennedy and my loathing of Allen Dulles. That I think, you know, if Prouty had it right, that was a perfect zinger that may have taken Dulles down a notch or two in his own self-estimation, because that is the big flaw with all of what they're doing. They're taking advantage of their ability to manipulate our minds through the media and through other ways, which we don't need to get into, but to manipulate our minds, to make us happy serfs, you know, the ones of us that they let to live, and to turn us, you know, away from reason and back towards obedience. You know, those silly baseball caps that said "obey" on them. That's all. That's not a joke. The idea of getting those words into your mind over and over again, right in your forehead, you know, that's more than a joke. That's a psychological weapon. So I see we've got some Kennedy up there. What you got, Andy?
Responsibilities of his office with unswerving purpose and high dedication. His 10 years of service in the Central Intelligence Agency have been the climax of a lifetime of unprecedented and devoted public service, beginning in the First World War and stretching through the administrations of 7 presidents. The outstanding contributions Mr. Dulles has made to the security of the United States have been based upon a profound knowledge of the role of the intelligence officer, a broad understanding of international relations, and a naturally keen judgment of men and affairs. The zestful energy and undaunted integrity of his service to his country will be an enduring example to the profession he has done so much to create. And I hereby present the United States of America to all who see these presents greetings. This is to certify that the President of the United States of America has awarded the National Security Medal to Allen W. Dulles for outstanding contribution to the national intelligence effort. November 1961.
All right. Well, that wasn't the one that I was referring to. But
Well,
okay, well,
you have to think about the context of that. Dulles was gone. Kennedy just fired him. And Kennedy was telling his advisors, we're going to break I'd like to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
Yep.
And this is the problem. If you're going to fight these guys, you can't do it behind closed doors. What would have happened had Kennedy in that meeting there been able to say, yes, Dulles was supposedly with us in World War II, but he was really with the fascist corporatists who funded Hitler and Mussolini and who set up the rat line to help ex-Nazis escape to South America and elsewhere to work with our intelligence community. Suppose he had told the truth. Now, people say you can't do that. You'll get killed. Well, he did get killed. This, I think, is one of the arguments people have, and they say, well, why didn't Trump do more to release the Kennedy assassination documents? Why didn't Trump do more to force the issue with Durham to get out the full story on who was committing crimes during Russiagate? You know, here's the real nub of the issue, John. We've just been through 4 years where I think at least 30 to 40% of the American people know that there was a lying narrative created against Donald Trump and against Putin to keep us at confrontation with Russia and to sustain the power of the people who were threatened by Trump's decision to become friends with Putin. Now, we've just seen that. Why did he pull back at the end of his term from continuing to expose that fully? And I think it had to do with the threats that were made to his family, to him, bankruptcy, financial destruction. You know, we see what they're capable of doing. We see what they're doing to the people who were in the Capitol on January 6th. You know, we see it where there are assassinations, where there are people jailed like Assange, people like Snowden who told the truth and he can't come back to this country. So there is a powerful force against being truthful. But there are people who stand up. And I think we have to really do more to honor the people who are the real whistleblowers and truth tellers, who are out there risking their lives, risking everything, the same way our founding fathers did by opposing the British Empire, to give us insights and glimpses into reality. And that's, you know, one of those kinds of people was Lyndon LaRouche, who committed the last 50 years of his life to speaking the truth, regardless of what happened to him, regardless of what was said about him, his frame up, his 5 years in prison doing hard time. And you go back and read his writings and his speeches and what he did during those years, it's fresh, as though he was looking at the world today and giving us insights into what had to be done. So the few people that act that way have to be an inspiration to the many, many people coming around now who say, why is all this happening? What can we do about it? And I think Kennedy's a perfect example, except he tried to do it behind closed doors. And you can't fight a secret government behind closed doors.
Those are quite important words from somebody that knows what he's talking about. I do appreciate that, Harley. And yeah, it is fear. Yeah, but it's also more than that. I mean, they have ways. I think. Remember when when Donald Trump suddenly got COVID and then suddenly got cured?
Pretty quick, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it was like, and now compare that to Steve Jobs, who got cancer and then was going to die, and then he got cured, and then he was going to die, and then he got cured, and then he died. Well, if there is an evil hand out there that is controlling medical issues as well as everything else in our society, then it's possible to look at an example like Donald Trump's COVID as a warning to say, hey, we giving you the easy ride here. We're going to fix you right up, but stop messing with us because we are in control. So just settle down, Donald, and do what we tell you. And then he's cured. Boom. And Mark Meadows saw him through the whole thing. How deep is Mark Meadows into that? Well, the military had no problem curing him, man. They had some zoom, whatever they gave him. I think they might have given him ivermectin, but anyway, he was dancing. Remember, look, I'm dancing.
Yeah.
You've seen all the dancing that goes on, like the dancing nurses in the hospitals. And then Joe Biden over Christmas, for his Christmas holiday, he and Jill invited a team of dancing nurses. And they were in their what do you call those the outfits, the one colored drab outfit that they wear,
Right.
and they were fabulous singers and dancers. They were really, really good. Now I'm sure there probably are real nurses because out of all the nurses in the world, they could easily get a superb chorus line, and these guys were great, really good, really tight and rehearsed, and right there in the White House. And you know what it was? It was the same thing as the dancing nurses in the opening of the Olympics in London in 2012. There they are. Look at that. Look at that. This is a psyop. This is not a bunch of nurses saying, hey, let's all get together and make a chorus and impress everybody, and maybe we'll get invited somewhere special. No, this is a produced psyop. And it has something to do with the behind-the-scenes messaging that was given to people in the 2012 opening of the Olympics when Prince Charles came out there and said, here's the way it's going to be. And they sent out all the little virus characters, and the children ended up in the hospital beds, and the nurses danced. And now we see the COVID, and now we see the nurses dancing. And they're saying, hey, we're running this. And we can make Donald Trump dance anytime we want to.
I have to say that I preferred for my Christmas entertainment you and your wife's duet. That was more real than this.
All right, Andy, enough of this. But you see what I'm saying? They are messaging each other. They're messaging through the media. This has been going on for years. And these creeps have created their own, culture that we're not part of. We're not privy to. We just get to see the part that they want us to see, like The Simpsons. This crazy, yeah. I mean, Donald Trump comes down the elevator on The Simpsons, and everybody sees it. Say, oh wow, that was pre-programming. Oh well, then now we know who's in charge, because if they can pre-program it, 10 years out, and then it happens right on live TV, that you're just a spectator. You don't have any real role, and they're in control. That's the message. We got this. We can make.
And look at how much money goes into produce the weekly National Football League games on television, and how much people end up totally engrossed in that and live and die by what happens to their team. And then you create fantasy football as an offshoot of that. So you have people living in a football fantasy world. You have the Harry Potter fantasy world. You have the War on Terror fantasy world, critical race theory fantasy world. You create these different environments. And you're right when you say these are psyops. There are many studies that have been done by institutions like the Tavistock Institute, which is outside of London, that look at the social and cultural susceptibilities of different groups by religion, by age, by race, by ethnicity. And then they pare it down even more than that to figure out how can you come up with something to control that person's emotions, whether it's a soap opera, whether it's something through the school. And that's what we're all subjected to. It's a fake universe. And if you try to get out of it, then you pay a price. Now, people have to be willing to pay the price of being ostracized or criticized by the mainstream if we're going to get this situation turned around. There's a worse condition to be in than being criticized by the mainstream media. And I can just tell you, again, in the case of Lyndon LaRouche, I was a spokesman for the last 20 years of his life. And the fact that he was called every bad word in the universe, from Nazi, communist, Stalinist, anti-Semite, it rolled off his back because he knew it was coming from people who were the ones who were the true evil beings. And as his legend grows, and when I say legend, he's known throughout the world as someone who didn't capitulate. And it's those kinds of individuals. And, I would say, John, for you to continue doing your program and making the sacrifices to do it, it's individuals like that that give people a sense that there are people bigger than the narrative, that there is a way to get outside of the bubble. And I know we're running short on time, so I'll just conclude with something that I think is really illustrative of this. In 1989, there were demonstrations that started outside a church in Leipzig, Germany, where 10 people got together and lit a candle to commemorate the lives lost under the East German secret police. And they were harassed by the Stasi, the secret police, that night. But a couple weeks later, 100 people showed up. And again, the police came out and threatened them. I think a few were beaten. But the word went out that there are people going out and lighting candles on Monday night to protest the dictatorship. During that time, Erich Honecker, who was the head of the Socialist Party, the Communist Party of East Germany, and the dictator of the country, said, our Reich will live 1,000 years. Almost the same words that Hitler had said. And he then called in the secret police and he said, I want you to crack heads. This has to stop. But the next week at that church plaza in Leipzig, there were 10,000 people. And the police made a decision not to crack the heads. And then all hell broke loose. And within a couple of weeks, the Berlin Wall came down. The Iron Curtain eventually fell. And it was people who finally had had enough and who took a step into the unknown. And I think this is this is what has to be in our hearts. We have to open our hearts to people who are suffering because of the consequences of these policies and bring them in with us to show them that we actually are the majority. And that if our country really does believe in the general welfare, we've got to retake the institutions and come up with the policies that will ensure that that's the case. So is there hope? Of course there's hope. As long as there's people who are alive and loving and thoughtful, there's always hope.
Thank you. I endorse that, of course, and I wanted to add to that a resource that I find to be absolutely wonderful, and it's called Neighborhood News Studio. Neighborhood News Studio is Aaron DeBala and Aaron Adler have put this together over the past couple of years. It's a labor of love. They're very, very good at what they're doing. And they are working their butts off, 12 hours a day, often, to carry this message forward. And they're reaching out to community members. They support local veterans groups. They talk to religious leaders and politicians. And they have a LaRouche organization in Michigan that they've had guests on the show a number of times. So Neighborhood News Studio is another beacon of light, a beacon of hope, and and deserves your support, folks out there that are aware of all the great work that Andy and Aaron and the news team does. Support Neighborhood News Studio. That would be my addition to the great words that you just spoke, Harley. It's a great mission that Andy and Aaron are on. Go ahead and put your banner up there, Andy, if you would, and so people can see how to get in touch with you. Just go to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. All right. It's been a great hour for me, Harley. Once again, thank you for making time with us during the holidays, and we wish you and your family and everyone over there in Germany a very happy, successful, and peaceful 2022. Thank you, Harley.
Okay, thank you, John. See you in a couple of weeks.
Great. Bye now.